Senator Cormann.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Madam Acting Deputy President, what does the Rudd government have against young people? We have this broken promise on student taxes. We have the unfair changes to the youth allowance. We had the tax hike last week and prosecuted over the past year on alcopops. And we, of course, have the mountains of debt which the young people of Australia will have to repay for decades.
Shame.
The young people of Australia are the losers under this government. And I say to the young people across Australia, if they don't want to pay this unfair student tax, if they don't want to be subject to the unfair tax measures that are prosecuted by this government, vote Liberal at the next election. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, this is yet another broken promise. And I, along with my colleagues, will just quote some of the comments that were made in the lead-up to the last election by the then Shadow Minister for Education, Stephen Smith. A journalist asked a question on the 22nd of May 2007. Are you considering a compulsory amenities fee on students? Mr. Smith. No. Well, firstly, I'm not considering a HEC-style arrangement. I'm not considering a compulsory HEC-style arrangement, and the whole basis of the approach is one of a voluntary approach. So I'm not contemplating a compulsory amenities fee, quote, unquote. But of course, we know that Peter Garrett put this footnote into the contract that the then Rudd opposition entered into with the Australian people. And the footnote said, once we get in, we just change it all. And this is yet another example of once we get in, we just change it all. And the young people across Australia, students across Australia, are being asked to pay a student tax which the government before the election said they would never consider. Now, of course students should not be forced to pay for services and amenities which they never use. Of course they shouldn't. And I'd like to just reflect on the experience that we've had in my home state of Western Australia, where the former Court government introduced voluntary student unionism in 1993. We had full voluntary student unionism in Western Australia between 1993 and 2001. And all of the student unions and guilds continued to exist and operate in Western Australia during that period. They did not disappear. They did not collapse or dissolve. On the contrary, they refined their operations and became more effective at giving students value for money. They were forced to respond to real student needs. And when VSU was reintroduced by the Howard government in 2005, the student guilds in Western Australia were the best placed in the country to deal with it. It led to the UWI Student Guild having the highest sign-up rates in the country because they were providing a valued service. And of course, by comparison, other student unions did not do as well because they were relying on the compulsory fee, had lost touch with what services students needed, and were not making a sufficiently valued life a contribution to university life. If you need a compulsory fee in order to fund your services, if you can't attract enough students to access your services and pay a fee towards that service, then maybe you need to reconsider whether your service is sufficiently valued. Now, we all know how compulsory fees have been abused in the past to fund the political activities of the left. And I was listening to Senator Crossan very carefully before. I was in my office and I rushed in here straight away. This is what she said, that the Howard government's VSU legislation cut the legs out from student unions who so effectively stood up for student rights against the Howard government. Now, why should any student be forced to pay for that? If a student wants to join a campaign, if a student wants to join a union to run a campaign against the Howard government or against any other government, against the policy measure of the previous, this or any next government, of course they should be free to do so. They should pay their fee, join the union, help fundraise, organise campaigns, be participants, active participants in the democratic debate. But they should not be forced by their government to join a union that stands for something they don't agree with. And the criticism here from Senator Crossan earlier in the second reading debate was exactly that. Like, somehow suggesting that the Howard government's motivation was to in introducing voluntary student unionism was to silence a critic. Well, the reality is this. The voluntary student unionism legislation did not abolish student unions. It did not stop students from freely associating. And that point has, of course, been made by some of my colleagues before. Now, some of the arguments put forward is that the fees envisaged in this piece of legislation will ensure that students will have access to vital student services. Now, who makes the decision? Who determines whether a particular service is vital or not? Who makes that decision? Well, it should be the student that accesses the service. It should be the student that accesses the service. Now, the VSU legislation did not ban the collection of fees by student unions and associations. However, what it did do is give students choice, and students deserve that choice. And why should students be forced to fund the political activities of organisations they don't agree with? I don't think that anybody has actually provided a proper and satisfactory response to that. And the point is made that students lose access to important sport and other social services without an amenities fees. Well, students again have a right to choose. Students have a right to choose what is important to them. It should not be assumed that a minority view of what is needed by students reflects the preference of all students. Madam Acting Deputy President, this is all about an ideological agenda from the Labour Party. The Rudd Labour government wants to force all students across Australia to fund the activities of its mates in a particular section of student politics. And we should not stand for this. We should not support this. Madam Acting Deputy President, the Senate should stand up to stop this student tax. We should defeat this legislation.